Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Trinity Long Room Hub online. My name is Eve Patton. I'm director of the Trinity Long Room Hub, which, for anybody joining us for the first time this evening, is Trinity's Institute for Research in the Arts and Humanities. So in the Hub, we draw together a wide range of disciplines from law to literature to history. And we also bring the outcomes and the insights of the research that we do to an external audience through our public humanities programme. The Trinity Long Room Hub's Behind the Headlines series, sponsored by the John Pollard Foundation, is a signature series for us. It has been running for 5 years, and in some of our previous panels, members of the audience may remember, we have turned our attention to the subject of Northern Ireland within the larger framework of our Futures of Ireland research theme. In this evening's discussion, we are looking at Northern Ireland once again, but this time with a very particular focus on the role of interdependence on the islands. It is now, as you know, 23 years since the Good Friday Agreement. Indeed, some recent commentators have suggested that the date of 1998 rather than 1921 might be regarded as a true beginning for Northern Ireland. In those 23 years, and particularly in the months since Brexit, obviously the agreement has been tested, but it remains intact. And despite many of the visible and violent scenes that we've witnessed in Belfast recently, there is a strong case to be made for continuing to think positively about progress in Northern Ireland, and also to consider the important role of interdependence. Northern Ireland does not exist in a vacuum, but within a constellation of nations, of regions, of legislative bodies, and of communities that, of course, must be part of the conversation, must be part of this forward momentum. How is this to be achieved or sustained? What kind of vocabulary does it require? Well, in this evening's panel, we have perspectives from 4 speakers who are going to reflect on prospects and challenges for interdependence and think more broadly about the future of Northern Ireland in this context. And I will introduce them to you now in the order that they're going to speak. I want to welcome very warmly to Trinity Professor Pete Shirlow. Pete is director at the University of Liverpool's Institute of Irish Studies, and he was formerly deputy director of the Institute for Conflict Transformation and Social Justice at Queen's University in Belfast. Pete, as many of you will know, has recently established the digital constitutional platform in the Institute of Irish Studies in Liverpool. And this brings together pro-union, pro-unity, and various alternative voices to address constitutional and related questions. I hope that we will have a link on that for you, but I know that the platform has received wide and positive coverage in the press. Our second speaker is Rory Montgomery, and Rory is no stranger, I think, to the Hub's audience. He is currently Policy Fellow in Residence at the Trinity Long Room Hub. Until recently, Rory was Second Secretary General at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, with responsibility for EU issues, including, God help him, Brexit. And before that, Rory has served as EU advisor to Enda Kenny, as Taoiseach, as ambassador to France, and as permanent representative to the European Union. But I think more pertinent to our discussion this evening, Rory was also a member of the Irish team which negotiated the Good Friday Agreement and the establishment of North-South institutions. So we look forward very much to hearing from you, Rory, and thank you for joining us. Our third speaker is Claire Sugden, and Claire, I want to extend a very warm welcome to you to Trinity. Claire is the only elected independent unionist member of the Legislative Assembly. She's MLA for East Londonderry, and she has served as Minister of Justice in the 4th Northern Ireland Executive. that ran from May 2016 to March 2017 under Northern Ireland First Minister Arlene Foster and the Deputy First Minister at that time, of course, the late Martin McGuinness. She has wide experience of Northern Ireland, right from grassroots level with the view from local councils, through to transatlantic perspectives, having participated in the Washington Ireland programme in 2010. Claire, we're really looking forward to hearing you this evening. And our fourth and final speaker, again, no stranger to this audience, is Etain Tanham. Etain is Associate Professor in International Peace Studies at Trinity in Dublin. Her main area of expertise is British-Irish cooperation and cross-border cooperation, with emphasis on Brexit's impact. She is a member of the University College London Working Group on referendums on the island of Ireland, and many of you I know will have been following the progress and the reporting of this group in the media. And she is also working with ARENS. ARENS is the project for analysing and researching unification on the island of Ireland. And this project is led by the Royal Irish Academy in partnership with the University of Notre Dame. So Etain, thank you for joining us. We're looking forward to hearing from all the speakers in what I know is going to be a very insightful and also a very respectful discussion, and to our audience who will appreciate a respectful discussion on this topic. I'll just give you a brief reminder of the format. Each of the speakers has 10 minutes and 10 minutes only to talk to you, and then after all four speakers have finished, we'll open up to the floor to Q&A or comments from all of you. So please do submit any questions or comments, keeping them as brief as you can, given the complexity of this topic. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And if you can, please do say something about yourself, give us your name, tell us where you are writing from. If you're following us on Facebook, you can also use the panel for questions that's in the comments section, and we'll take as many of these questions as we can, given the time pressures. We're also, of course, streaming on our US media platform, Irish Central, so my greetings to that audience. And as always, we will be on Twitter. If you are tweeting, we have the handle @TLRHub, and we use the hashtag Hub Matters, hashtag Hub Matters. And again, we'll put those details in the chat for you so you can check them if you need to. So with all the housekeeping done, I want to welcome again our audience and welcome our four speakers. And I will now hand over to Pete Shirlow. Pete.
Thank you very much, Eve. I'm unmuted yet. Thank you very much. And you've set me an unenviable task as somebody from Belfast, which is to speak for only 10 minutes. That's a Herculean task for most Belfast people. I'll probably be through the first sentence in 5 minutes. I'll be up. So anyway, first of all, I hope tonight is a positive engagement for us all. And I think in particular, I really hope to get across the message that it is a falsehood that people from the pro-union community do not engage in debates about constitutional issues and issues to do with interdependence. In the last 8 weeks, I have noted 29 examples of engagement by conference and workshop. And as Eve has kindly mentioned, last month we launched a digital platform on constitutional issues, which contain around 130 pro-union and pro-unity arguments. I think it's also important to understand that much of the pro-union community is understood by external views. And I find that at times those views undermine the name, the reputation, and the capacity to understand the progressive thinking that is located within that community. At worst, pro-union people who are progressive are rendered invisible. And I think there's a misunderstanding, or sometimes there's a perception that progressive thinking people who are pro-union are a minority. And I actually think that's not the case. This is the reality, of course, is in the surveys that we do that the most socially liberal people are pro-union, and many of those people who are pro-union don't vote. So let's not measure that community by political representatives, except for Claire, of course. And but let's understand there's much more diversity within that community. So the other thing I want to get across tonight is about choice, the question of choice as we have these debates and as we think about the future. Community commentators and politicians, those of them who believe that the two parts of our island are composed of bounded ethno-national groups, and those people who wish to promote essentialist precepts about our identities. They should, of course, press ahead with a binary constitutional referendum. That is their understanding of democracy, the politics of 50 plus one. But I would suggest that identity type politics within this debate does little more than promote discord and disharmony. I think, on the other hand, if we understand and promote multicultural hybridity and connectivity as the guiding ideas for the negotiation of our future, if we get into the very process of talking about social relationships, we then foster something very different. We shouldn't be using the politics of 100 years ago to explain the politics of today. I'm sure somebody in 1921 would never have thought about the internet, social media, globalization, and the world we live in today. 16% of the workforce in the Republic, for example, are from ethnic minority backgrounds. It's a very different place. I think if we do that, I think if we promote multiculturalism and hybridity and connectivity, then what we get into is something that is much less dramatic as a trajectory of human change. I think we identify the complexity of identification processes, and we give greater agency to the definition and how we relate to each other and how we understand ourselves. In this respect, a focus on relationships rather than referenda is more likely to unite the people who live in these islands. So I have a set of PowerPoints, which somebody will put up very soon. And given the 10-minute rule, I will hurtle through these like there's no tomorrow. And these, are, of course, are available on request for everybody else. So what I've done is in slides 1 to 8, which, as I said, I'll go through very quickly, is this is the reaction you get if you have that binary identity type project. I want to go through slides 1 to 8, how sections of unionism or pro-unionism will apply whenever they are told Northern Ireland is a backwater or Northern Ireland is a basket case. In the next series of slides, what I want to do is appraise and praise the peace process. And as Eve has already said, the 1998 Belfast Agreement remains this site. It remains this site. There's no other site, I don't think, through which we afford greater agency to change and progress. And then in the final 3 slides, I want to invoke the concept of interdependence and how we stretch beyond the politics of our immiseration. So these first 8 slides are what I receive, my phone beeps or my email beeps, whenever somebody who supports Irish unity makes comments about Northern Ireland. So one of these that arrived recently was, well, look, here's Eurostat figures. Ireland has much greater per capita debt than the UK. This country is not capable of absorbing us in terms of the subvention and in terms of our standards of living, etc. The next slide, please. This came across recently, where people in social media were talking about racism within unionism, and the reaction that came back was the latest Eurostat data yet again. This was trending all across social media, that people of ethnic minority status in Ireland were twice as likely to state negative and hostile comments about their skin color, their ethnicity, and their racism. So this is the binary. If you say Northern Ireland's racist, the UK is racist, somebody goes off and finds the data which says something very different. It keeps us within this binary conversation. Next slide, please. Recently in this debate, you'll have seen about, who's better off. We do know who's better off on this island: middle class people, the people who are not well off and have not benefited from the 2 states, are those on low incomes, or what we would used to call the working class. So you get this type of reaction. House prices are cheaper in Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland's a much cheaper place to live. You have more disposable income. And of course, the argument here, of course, is that we have a united Ireland, we will have these spiraling housing costs, and this will detract from our well-being. Because we have to realize much of what is pro-unionism is not an identity question, it actually is a question of material well-being. Thank you. Next slide, please. Yet again, the same thing, just another example of when people say about, the South's a better place to live, then you get this type of analysis which comes through in terms of renting, the much higher levels and costs of renting across the Republic. Thank you. Of course, one of the other big issues is that of the National Health Service. And recently somebody posted that you pay for the health service in Northern Ireland, it's not free. Well, of course, we do it, our national insurance, which is also our pensions and other maternity payments, etc., etc. But then this appeared on social media. Somebody had gone onto the site and found, and you can read this whenever you get the slides, the cost of going to the doctor, how much you pay. People in the south forgo going to the doctor if they can't, if it incurs costs in that way. And you see there at the bottom, 1 in 4 adults in the south have said they wouldn't go to a GP because of cost, compared to 1 in 50 in the UK. So we get this binary that constantly reflects itself when we have that high level identity type debate. It's not a debate, obviously, it's something below that. Next video, please. Of course, the other issue is the North is dysfunctional, it has low pay economy, and of course what appears then is this, which is the percentage share of people who are working per, those who earn less than 40% of the median wage. Ireland, the worst in Europe, as the intention of sending this graphic out, etc. So if we move on to the next slide, you'll also find within pro-unionism or unionism that they will use, for example, this central bank, the Irish Central Bank, a report recently in their letters, in which evidence will be used from Southern commentators also, that consumption per head is much higher in the UK than it is in Ireland. So this is a circular, continual, 2 legs good, 4 legs bad, Orwellian type debate or discussion or argument, which really doesn't do very much at all to secure any thinking about interdependence or how we build better relationships across the island. Next slide, please. And of course, here's another example of this with other Southern commentators who have said standard of living is higher in Northern Ireland, and within this, some of this more positive stuff about the new economy post-conflict in terms of wage growth. And Belfast has developed as this very high-tech city in which you do see this high level of high-paid work and software investment within the city. And of course, one of the comments I noticed recently on social media was the last line, not bad for a city in which a quarter of the retail space was destroyed during the conflict. So when you're talking about progress, you're talking about development within the post-conflict economy, and it relates straight back to the conflict. It relates straight back to that really harsh and quite bitter at times exchange of ideas and perspectives. So if we move on, we've had this peace process. This is the second way we can start to really start this conversation. The significant growth in the share of Catholics within the PSNI. If we look at the next slide then, this really significant growth since 2009, over 70% for both communities who have high level confidence in policing in Northern Ireland. The type of things that aren't in these debates, the change in the nature of relationships, the change in the way institutions of the state are now welcomed and supported in an inter-community way. Okay. Also, the argument about when we talk, we hear all of this, that people are talking about the constitutional question like never before. The constitutional question is never off people's lips. This is from our last household survey of Northern Ireland, and we group people by age. You can see very clearly that the issues for young people are education, economy, and employment, and for older people, slightly more relevance for them is health, poverty, and welfare. Within those two communities, 3.2 and 5.9% say the constitutional issue is the most important issue to them. So we move on to the next slide. Then, let's look at this. We're told there's this Brexit effect. We're told that Brexit's the game changer. These are the surveys which ask people in blue, do you wish to remain in the UK? In orange, ironically, do you want to do you want to have a united Ireland? And you can see since 2016, through the lifetime of Brexit, that there's been virtually no decline in the support within those surveys for staying within the UK. What's critically important here is that the share of people who support remaining in the UK is much more likely to have Catholic and immigrant support than is the share of those people from those backgrounds, or sorry, Protestants and immigrants who support unification. So we have this data, we have this evidence, but we still have this perception that the growth for Irish unification is growing very dramatically. That's not saying this won't change. That's not saying that demographic shifts won't alter that position. But we have to have evidence as the basis of the conversations that we are going to have. Next slide, please. Let's just look at Westminster elections if you don't believe the surveys. The blue line is the UUP and the DUP. The orange line is the Sinn Féin and the SDLP. And the bottom line is Alliance. The biggest shift in the last 2 decades in elections in Northern Ireland has been the growth of the Alliance Party. We talk about unionists have lost the majority within elections, but nationalist vote has also gone down. There's something changing here. That more liberal, social, the engaged, younger generation is starting to vote in different ways. That is a massive shift from nearly 3% right through to nearly 20%. So we move on to the last couple of slides very quickly. So what we talk about when we mean interdependence is we're talking about these questions of getting beyond the binary. We're talking about building up the Good Friday Agreement. We're talking about enhancing all Ireland relationships. Go to the next slide very quickly. We're talking about one of the things that's missed in the protocol, the argument about sea borders, etc. The protocol actually extends the Good Friday Agreement. It talks about these north-south levels of cooperation, which are critically important. And I know I've run over a very last slide, which I'll do very quickly. So one of the things we need to do is frame this debate differently. For those who are pro-union, greater north-south connection, building interdependence across this island can make the border so invisible that the desire for unification abates. For those who are pro-unity, greater independence can re-establish connections cast asunder by partition. And this type of interdependence, building all Ireland relationships, building it within an agreed way, is the antidote to this politics of immiseration and dissidence that has crippled Northern Ireland and Ireland for so long. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed, Pete. That was fascinating, I must say. And as it happens, like Attain, I'm a member of the steering committee of this ARINS project run by the Royal Irish Academy and the University of Notre Dame, analysing and researching Ireland North and South. And one of its objectives is precisely to prepare detailed, objective research on many of the topics that you've mentioned. And in fact, I'll be citing one of the articles on health systems north and south in a couple of moments. As Eve said, I worked for a number of years, arguably the best years of my life, on Northern Ireland issues in the 1990s and into the early 2000s. And as well as the Friday Agreement itself, I was involved for the year after the agreement very much on establishing the North-South Ministerial Council and the implementation bodies, which were such an important part of the agreement. So I found it very interesting preparing this evening to take a look, an overview of the state of North-South cooperation. And I have a few broadly positive observations to make, and others which I wouldn't call negative, but which are perhaps a little bit more challenging or questioning. I mean, the first positive point I want to make is that, as I'm sure a vast number of people in the audience tonight will know, that there is a huge reservoir of existing cooperation and goodwill on the island across many, many sectors. I mean, there are bodies which long predate the establishment of two separate entities on the island. Sport, people talk about a lot, rugby and cricket and hockey, the GAA, of course, as well. But there are other bodies as well, the Royal Irish Academy, for example, the Irish Congress of Trade Unions. So there are a range of all-Ireland bodies. And then secondly, there are all-Ireland bodies. And then secondly, there are bodies set up specially to promote cooperation and understanding North and South. Just to name a few, the Centre for Cross-Border Studies in Armagh, Cooperation Ireland, the large-scale NGO, the IBEC, CBI, Northern Ireland Joint Council, etc. Though it is strange when you look at it that there are some anomalies, if you like, in this, that racehorses are dealt with on an all-island basis. This is something which is very dear to my heart. But poodles and other breeds of pedigree dog there's a partition between the two. Now, in my own experience as well, I mean, the North-South contacts are very real. I mean, my own parents came to Dublin from Belfast to study. My son, before the pandemic, was traveling regularly from Belfast down to Dublin for his job. And two things I've been involved in myself personally, the Cancer Trials Ireland have been very much involved in reanimating a cancer research consortium between North and South and the US National Cancer Institute and the Centre Culturel Irlandais in Paris. It receives resident artists who are funded by the Arts Council of Northern Ireland, as well as getting funding from the Republic. And then, of course, the levels of trade are very important as well. In the last available year, 4.7 billion in sales of goods and services from north to south, and 2.7 billion from south to north. Though, of course, in both cases, the overall figures are smaller than trade with Great Britain. And then you have the areas of official cooperation. And perhaps the most comprehensive account of all of these was actually in a document prepared during the Brexit negotiations. It was published without much fanfare in August 2019. It was a joint mapping exercise carried out by the British government and the European Commission with the assistance of the Irish government. And it identified no fewer than 154 different areas of cooperation across a very wide range of sectors: agriculture, health, education, justice, security, energy, arts, culture, etc. Now, some of these I think are probably much more substantial than others. Others may be largely matters of aspiration or rhetoric. But even to look at random at the list, it's quite extraordinary. You have the wholesale electricity market, a very big deal indeed. You have cooperation between school inspectorates, north and south. You have the national pollination, the Irish All-Island Pollination Initiative. You had flood risk management. You have road and rail safety, etc., etc. So there's an extraordinary amount of work going on. And you have 6 implementation bodies and the North-South Ministerial Council as well. And the North-South Ministerial Council has suffered over the years because when the executive hasn't been in place, it hasn't been possible to have cooperation, to have meetings involving ministers, but the bodies continue their work notwithstanding. And last year, after the reinstatement of the executive and the assembly, there were meetings in all of the relevant areas of the NSMC, all of the sector it deals with. There were 2 plenary meetings involving the First and Deputy First Ministers and the Taoiseach and Taoiseach and others, and 2 meetings between the Minister for Foreign Affairs and the First Minister and Deputy First Minister. And then, of course, the third positive, which I think Pete mentioned in his slide, one of his slides, is, of course, Taoiseach's Shared Island initiative. Now, this is an important statement on his part, just how much value he and the Irish government attach to North-South cooperation, and North-South cooperation without any agenda other than people on the island working together to mutual benefit. As everyone knows, there's a €500 million fund which has been made available to the initiative. There's a new focus on strategic challenges such as climate and biodiversity. And the hope is to finalize a number of investment projects such as the A5 road to Derry, which have been in abeyance for a long time. Now, these are all great positives, and I would say that my personal knowledge from the Micheál Martin's sincerity on this matter and his determination to avoid old-style polarizing arguments are absolutely genuine and sincere. I worked for him years ago, and he was exactly the same then as he is now. But a few questions then. How vigorous is this cooperation in practice? Like I say, there are 154 areas listed in this document, and it's most impressive. But like I said, I think some are much more active and much more impactful than others. And it is interesting to note that, I mean, in the paper I referred to about health cooperation on the island of Ireland by Professor Deirdre Heenan of the University of Ulster, which came out as part of that Royal Irish Academy initiative I was mentioning, And then in the comment on it by Professor Anne Matthews, who's from DCU, they agreed that while in many ways there are obvious advantages to greater cooperation between North and South, there are major obstacles to it happening. The financial basis of the health services in the two countries are very different. The structures are very different. And they would argue too that, while there have been some very good individual initiatives, such as the Northwest Cancer Initiative headquartered in Altnagilville Hospital in Derry, and there's also a congenital heart disease centre as well, as I understand it. But the reality is that in many cases, there isn't a great deal of political impetus or push from either side of the border. There's been a lot of debate about COVID, whether or not cross-border cooperation could have been better, whether one response was more effective than another. But they would argue that overall, there are major challenges. And one of the points they made, in fact, is precisely that we don't actually have reliable statistics on which to look carefully, on the basis of which to examine carefully potential in this area. So that's an example. It's an obvious area. It's one which everybody mentions. But in practice, while impressive things have been done, there are obstacles to more effective engagement. Also, I know from my own experience that North-South cooperation is often not a priority for government departments and for ministers. Now, there are some who have a personal commitment, and there are others who take their cue, of course, from the Taoiseach and success of Taoiseach. But there are no vote, put crudely, there's no one voting in Northern Ireland will vote. Nobody will be voting in a core constituency will be directly affected much by North-South cooperation. Often there are no particular incentives for departments to get engaged. My own experience always was that the Department of the Taoiseach and the Department of Foreign Affairs often had to whip along others to show a greater degree of enthusiasm and initiative. Maybe that's not the case anymore, but it's a problem. And there can sometimes be competing interests. When we were looking at areas of North-South cooperation back 20 years ago after the Good Friday Agreement, one absolute no-no was cooperation on inward investment. The IDA was very clear. It was competing internationally for inward investment, and Northern Ireland was in a way a competitor. The final problem, which I might just finish on, is that politics, of course, is inseparable from North-South cooperation of a practical kind. The history of North-South cooperation, politically very, very fraught. People may remember that the Council of Ireland envisaged in the 1920 Government of Ireland Act never came into effect. The Council of Ireland agreed at Sunningdale in 1973 was one of the reasons, though maybe not the main reason, why unionism ultimately rejected the agreement. And in the Good Friday Agreement negotiations, hard as it may be to imagine it now, the North-South aspects, the Strand 2 aspects, were the most hotly contested between the Ulster Unionists and the Irish government and the SDLP. And in fact, right to the very end, they were hugely difficult. And I think in a way, one of the issues has been, is North-South cooperation about practical benefit, or is it symbolic as well? And if it's symbolic, is it preparing for a United Ireland? Or is it actually an alternative, possibly, to United Ireland? And those questions are always there in the back of people's minds, no matter how practical and sensible the cooperation can be. Unionists over time have been very cautious about full engagement in the North-South institutions. The DUP, especially at the beginning of their time in office, were really hesitant. And also it's revealing and sad that one of the immediate reactions to the storm over the protocol has been a rush to halt any certainly high-profile North-South engagement. So politics is always there, and the question is, how do you manage North-South affairs in such a way as to keep the politics away from them as much as possible, but knowing that there will always be a political dimension? And the reality as well is that I'll be interested, I hope that we'll have lots of good questions now this evening about the issues Pete has raised and the rest of us are talking about. But I know myself that very often when you appear in this kind of panel, what people want to talk about is border polls and referendums and what will United Ireland look like. And to be frank, these issues are often more interesting and grab the headlines more easily. And my final point is simply this. I think on the theme of interdependence, I think we in the South, and all of us who advocate greater North-South cooperation as an end in itself, but also because of what it does about bringing people together and understanding, we have to accept that many of the arguments which support North-South cooperation are also valid when it comes to cooperation between Ireland and Great Britain, and indeed, one might argue, between Ireland, Great Britain, and the rest of Europe. So interdependence works in a number of different directions, and we aren't little cut off entities, all separate one from the other. I'm sorry, well, I don't know if you're sorry that my face disappeared from the screen, but I'm sorry if my connection has made it impossible to maintain the visual. So with any luck, I'll be back again to answer questions later on.
Good evening, everyone. It is my pleasure to be able to talk to you this evening. In 2014, I became an independent member of the Northern Ireland Assembly. And to become an MLA, it's required that you designate as a unionist, a nationalist, or other as per the Good Friday Agreement. And this is necessary to ensure cross-community consent if required in decisions taken by the Northern Ireland Assembly. And that's given the nature of our deeply divided society and where we were in 1998. My constitutional preference is to remain within the United Kingdom, as I believe it is the best context in which to serve the people of Northern Ireland. Indeed, as someone who considers herself Irish as well as British, which is a wonderful benefit of the Good Friday Agreement, I believe that Northern Ireland remaining within the United Kingdom is the best context for Ireland to serve her people, which I think is an important factor when we consider interdependency of these islands. Because for me, politics is about people and providing public services for those people. Therefore, it's entirely relevant to think about the best context in which to provide those services. So when I designate as a unionist, I'm thinking of everyone in Northern Ireland and how best I can be their representative insofar as public services. In 2021, would really like to move the discussion away from unionism and nationalism being simply a green and orange concept. It's an environment in which we need to do our best for all. Undoubtedly, both unionism and nationalism in Northern Ireland are enveloped in cultural differences, religion, community, and I do appreciate the context and the history of why this is the case. But 23 years on from the Good Friday Agreement and in a state of relative peace, unionism and nationalism, I think, do need to be viewed as a context rather than an identity, which is what I believe the Good Friday Agreement intended. It didn't want us to be neutral. It wanted us to be ourselves and embrace one another and respect one another. And perhaps that's the missing piece of the jigsaw insofar as implementing the Good Friday Agreement. I also want to talk about unionism generally and how it is perceived. I am an independent unionist in the Northern Ireland Assembly. The other unionist parties represented in the Assembly are the Democratic Unionist Party, the Ulster Unionist Party, and the Traditional Unionist Voice, who's represented by one member, very similar to myself, as in being just one backbencher. So political unionism is undoubtedly representative by political parties who tend to have conservative right-wing views. Indeed, the confidence and supply agreement that the DUP had with the Conservative Party would suggest that there's some sort of conservative perspective coming from them. And not so long ago, the Ulster Unionist Party had links with the Conservative Party and Unionist Party of the United Kingdom, and they fielded candidates under this umbrella title in 2011. So if we look up at the makeup of unionism in the Northern Ireland Assembly, I suppose I can go some way in understanding that unionism is characterised by those right-wing, more conservative parties with traditional values. But for me, unionism is fundamentally a political ideology which considers the constitutional position of Northern Ireland either remaining within the UK or moving towards a united Ireland. And I think we nearly need to desensitize the cultural and religious and community aspects of what unionism and nationalism means, because I think that's important if we're really to understand why problems still exist within Northern Ireland. I think it would be remiss of me not to talk of the recent events in Northern Ireland and the recent unrest over the last number of weeks. And perhaps that almost contradicts my ask of trying to move away from it being a green and orange issue and more toward a contextual one. As anything to do with Northern Ireland, it's complicated. And I think for me anyway, trying to understand what has happened in the last number of weeks and from the unrest, I think it's a number of factors, but ultimately I think it is people feeling that they are not being represented. You know, and that in itself points to why we can't characterize the unionism around parties like the DUP or the Ulster Unionist Party, because indeed the arrest that we're seeing seems to be happening within working class loyalist communities. You're saying that they're feeling disenfranchised by current political unionism. So we have another example where unionism isn't felt like they're being represented at Stormont. I think people feel that they haven't been listened to. The Good Friday Agreement required the consent of loyalism to get over the line and be endorsed by a majority of people in Northern Ireland when it was put to the people in 1998. And I think what has happened in recent times, particularly in questions of Brexit and the protocol, it has given rise to concerns around not being listened to and not being heard and not being represented. And whether that is whether that has substance, to an extent we're beyond that. I think there are a significant number of people who feel they're not being represented, and I think that's something that we need to look forward in Northern Ireland. The protocol in itself is essentially a trade issue, but as I've already discussed, it is giving rise to questions of identity. And I think that's something, again, which perhaps even contradicts my earlier position about saying that we need to move away from the constitutional positions as being cultural and enveloped in identity. But the reality is that does still exist for people. So I think there is a piece of work in recognising what unionism is and what it means. I think another observation that I've had in relation to the unrest and what has maybe given rise to this is we are talking about the constitutional position, not just on the island of Ireland, but indeed right across the UK. And it is giving rise again to ideas that we may one day have a border poll and then the people of Northern Ireland and Ireland will eventually decide. But some people would almost suggest that that's an inevitable position, which it's not, and I think actually flies in the face of the Good Friday Agreement, because the most important part of the Good Friday Agreement is self-determination. So to be told that isn't the case, I think again is unsettling people who assumed that they would have consent, and consent is a word that's being used a lot in recent weeks. So I think that's an important consideration. And all of this then impacts on how things are implemented in Northern Ireland, whether it's the institutions of the Northern Ireland Assembly and the government in the Northern Ireland Executive, but also those institutions that help implement the law. And recently we saw issues with that in terms of the policing, confidence in policing. And it hasn't helped recent discussions around that. So again, to come back to my point, is that everything in Northern Ireland does tend to be complicated. And I think it does also demonstrate how volatile the situation in Northern Ireland remains. And perhaps that's something we should come to expect, because yes, whilst the Good Friday Agreement was over 23 years ago, we are still in our infancy and in our journey in implementing the Good Friday Agreement. And I would like to get back to the principles of that. I would like to get back to what that intended, and I would like to fully implement it in the areas that we haven't done. And I think that's namely about bringing people together, reconciling, understanding our difference, respecting our difference, and trying to find a way forward for all. And, you know, that's not just about Northern Ireland, that's the people of Ireland, that's the people of the United Kingdom, because we all do have a very important relationship with one another, and particularly post-Brexit. And, you know, I think the focus now after the politics of the last number of years needs to get back to people. So I look forward to hearing your questions and your comments on those thoughts. Thank you.
Sorry, you're muted.
Apologies. So thank you to all the speakers. Thank you to Eve for inviting me, and to the team in the Long Room Hub for arranging this. I am going to talk about the East-West relationship, and it will overlap with some of the themes that Pete has talked about, but really with everyone in different ways, as I'll show. I'm starting off by just briefly, in a way, defining interdependence, which seems very academic, but obviously it means the deliverance of the fact that we depend on each other in various ways, and the maximization of all those interconnections that we have and the benefits that they bring. But when I was thinking about this presentation and thinking about what's happened with Brexit on this island and between these, I thought of the concept of security community, which is a very, well, relatively old one from the 1950s, which was used to describe the relationship between the UK and Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, as a relationship that was peaceful and that was non-conflictual. And this was meant militarily. But one of the terms used, or some of the terms used, were, I suppose, sociological, but the ones that stood out for me and still do were that countries and peoples should have a sense of we feeling and mutual sympathy, so that what happens to them affects everyone, that there is this sense of being in it together. And with Brexit, of course, that we feeling, and it was never perfect, or mutual sympathy, but you know, such as it was on the islands, has declined, and particularly between obviously London and Dublin, but also between communities in Northern Ireland, and between, at the moment, Unionists and the Irish government. So I took that as a starting point. And I, as Claire was talking about, really went back to basics, which for me, and everyone has talked about, Pete and Rory, is the Good Friday Agreement. So I started off by going back to the basic question, why East-West cooperation? Why talk about it? Because it's something that isn't actually talked about as much. You know, perhaps at various times in the 90s, I'd have heard about it more in the late 90s, in the early millennium, but it doesn't get a huge amount of attention. So the reasons, firstly and primarily, it's provided for in the Good Friday Agreement under Strand 3. Both the British Irish Council, representing Wales and Scotland, the Dominion countries or groups, Northern Ireland, Ireland and England on the BIC that meets every 6 months, and the British Irish Intergovernmental Conference, representing the British and Irish governments, that is stated in the agreement should meet regularly to deal with issues of mutual concern that are non-devolved. So it's provided for, it's there. And I suppose it was there for a reason that was very crucial, and that reason can be found very much in John Hume's approach to dealing with the conflict, to resolving the conflict in Northern Ireland. It was there because of his emphasis on the totality of relations, that relations had to run smoothly and be managed and strengthened across the islands to underpin peace, that it was crucial. It wasn't subsidiary, and I think, I know Rory will know more about this than me, but the focus seemed to become very much on Strand 1 in the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, on the internal relations within Northern Ireland and the executive, and the huge joy over the power sharing executive being established. But the strands were interdependent, and that's stated in the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. So therefore, Strand 3, the East-West relationship in that way, was never meant to be subsidiary. It was meant to be, you know, an equal partner in many ways. It was also, as I'm sure everyone realizes on the panel and knows more than me, it was there as well because it was part of a package deal for unionists. And Rory has talked about the contentiousness of accepting cross-border cooperation in the negotiations that led to the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. One of the incentives was that there would also be emphasis on East-West relations and on developing relations within units within the Union, so that it was within that context, and that was something which would be welcome for Unionists and would be also, it was hoped, I suppose, reassuring. The other reason why East-West cooperation, why I would look at it now, is Brexit. Because as I said, starting off, Brexit on so many levels has threatened the potential for East-West cooperation and threatened existing cooperation, undermined it already. So most obviously, the decline in trust between the British and Irish governments. But apart from that, we have the implications of barriers to trade, of the fact that the British government did not opt for a soft Brexit, which affects Ireland as well, the Republic of Ireland, which has implications for our trading relations and road haulage and, you know, access to European Union markets, etc. So that has been a huge economic impact, potentially, and administratively, the management of the ports, the modernisation of Rosslare to deal with that. But also, as I said, politically, creating a cleavage and division which seemed to get worse over the years. It was definitely far worse than I expected when the referendum in 2016 happened. I expected there to be closer cooperation. That has not emerged and has got worse, particularly under the Johnson government. So there is a need to think about East-West cooperation intergovernmentally and also more broadly speaking as well. So strand 3, as I've said, is to deal with issues of mutual concern. And the reason why now that is so important is to help compensate for the loss of networks now that the UK has left the European Union. So nearly, you know, any institution that is there should be used, should be maximized to help, can't replace EU networks, but to help fill that gap, to ensure that there is maximum communication, informal talks and formal. And although, of course, often formal things can neglect what is really meaningful cooperation, at the same time, I know from having spoken to representatives on the British Irish Council, although it's seen as quite a tame organisation, it's consultative, many of them have referred to the opportunities to go for dinner after, to talk over coffee, and the things that we associate with the EU. So these institutions are vital. They've been underused, but within the context of a post-Brexit world, they are potentially extremely important, and they have been mentioned and emphasised in the government's programme for government, emphasised very much by Micheál Martin as well in the Shared Island vision, but by the Irish government, and mentioned also by Theresa May when she was Prime Minister, that there was a need for networks. She didn't specify these, and the development of networks. So it's for that reason East-West is important not to forget and to emphasise, given the post-Brexit world, given Brexit. In addition, the focus really of, I suppose, of my research until quite recently was very much on that London, Dublin, Belfast axis. But in addition, East-West cooperation, paradoxically perhaps, has taken a dynamic move after Brexit, looking at Scotland, Wales, and relations between those areas and the Republic of Ireland, and also potentially Northern Ireland. So that there was a galvanizing of energy around developing links that diversified away from just examining London. And that seems to be a side effect, partially a side effect at least, of Brexit. It means that if you look at interdependence within that context, and drawing on what Pete has said on the value of looking at interdependence where you're not focusing on binary issues, that we make that non-binary approach even more possible, because bearing in mind what Rory has said about the political obstacles to developing interdependence, if it can be placed within that wider framework as well, you take some of the heat and the tension out of the constitutional issue and the linkage of cross-border cooperation with nationalist aims, which is not real, in my opinion, but on the other hand, very much perceived to exist. And as Claire said, what is perceived to exist matters. If it's believed, there are facts which will defend it for those who believe it. So having this wider context helps manage, in my opinion, that sensitivity and builds into Pete's approach to interdependence being positive. Other reasons why it's important to help encourage business cooperation, and the British Irish Chamber of Commerce was established, if I'm correct, very much on foot of Brexit as well, to develop trade and business links between the islands post-Brexit. The other reason is back to mutual sympathy. Having that broader framework, having communication, using the Strand 3 institutions should and could help develop mutual awareness of each other's preferences, histories, beliefs, and pluralism in the Republic of Ireland, as well as policy exchange and pragmatic benefits as well. So these are all the reasons why it's important, why it should not be neglected. The current situation, as I've said, is very tense British-Irish relations, a lack of trust, and an uncertainty about the role of the British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference. So as most of you will know, there have been calls for it to be made. Neil Richmond in Fine Gael has called for it to be convened. The Irish government, would also prefer for it to meet and to have that robustness really that was missing. And as I said, it has been mentioned by Micheál Martin. However, again, as most of us will know, it is very sensitive for unionists who regard it as unwelcome Irish interference. And there is the issue as to what is its remit. So Brandon Lewis at the weekend said that, for example, policing and rioting, they are devolved issues. They are not issues that should be discussed in the BIIGC. So there's a question mark if there is such deep reluctance by some to use the BIIGC, then how much effort should be put in to pushing for it from the Irish government side? Should new bilateral arrangements be created instead? So that, is to my knowledge where we are at in terms of the BIIGC. My personal preference, as many or some people will know, is that it is part of the agreement. It has potential to be used, and it is an avenue that should represent the voices of unionists in the way that Claire said, that the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, whether rightly or wrongly, it is not perceived by many in Northern Ireland to represent their interests and to have given them influence. So the BIIGC is a way where the British government, by using it robustly, should represent unionist and loyalist interests. And also the executive has a right under the Belfast Good Friday Agreement to have a role, to be consulted, to be involved in the BIIGC. I must speed up. So accelerated cooperation, as I mentioned, has occurred between the other units within the UK and Ireland. We have the launch last year of the Scotland-Ireland Strategic Review and a smaller scale Wales-Ireland Review also. We've consular offices, one of which reopened in Cardiff, increased staff in the Edinburgh Consular Office. This is looking at the Dublin representation. And then we have Scottish representatives and Welsh in Dublin, Catherine Hallett and John Webster. In addition, a new consular office has been opened in Manchester. So there's a diversification away from the Dublin connection simply emphasising London, but really moving away to developing links across the UK, which could be nurtured, which is an example of how interdependence could and is being developed. Looking at what does this entail, and I was very interested listening to Rory again on the cross-border dimension. Is it symbolic or is it pragmatic? How important really is it? I'd argue it is largely symbolic. It's focusing on, I suppose, soft issues. But then, if you're looking at relations between Scotland and Ireland, they are often soft issues generally compared to the more contentious cross-border relationship. So it's looking at cultural cooperation, higher educational cooperation between the universities post-Brexit, looking at business relations, looking at the diaspora, the numbers who are of Scottish descent living obviously in Northern Ireland particularly, but also in Ireland, and then the numbers of Irish descent in Scotland. Examples of this poetry cooperation, poetry competition, looking at the poets of Northern Ireland and of Ireland and of Scotland. Quite a big initiative on St. Columba, St. Columkill, his connection, Iona, and trade missions. Wales, similarly, it's looking at these soft areas, cultural areas. So the future scenario, Brexit has caused momentum between Dublin, Edinburgh and Scotland. Where I found a gap was where is Belfast? And I think the stop-start executive situation, the collapses and the restoration, the issues politically within Northern Ireland itself, Brexit itself, perhaps have hindered a more progressive approach institutionally, but I'm open to be corrected about that, between the units, paradoxically really, given that they are part of the East-West broader dimension that should attract unionists. Obviously there is damage. There is an attempt to reset the British-Irish relationship intergovernmentally. It is unlikely to be the way it was, given that the UK has left, you know, even in the best scenario. And there will be new bilateral institutions. There is a question mark about what the role of the BIIGC is, not that it's gone, but where does it fit in to the future, given the hostility by some to it. The UK has left, so the framework has changed. And there is the question for the Irish government: how much effort does it put into UK relations when its alliance body is the European Union? For Northern Ireland, that effort is essential. And I'm sure the Irish government would see that most clearly. Various parties, although obviously again not all, in Northern Ireland would see it as essential. But there is an issue of where does the attention go? And it's interesting, therefore, that the Shared Island Unit, contrary to what was requested by Steve Aiken in the UUP, is the Shared Island Unit, not Shared Islands, perhaps reflecting that a little, but also reflecting, I think, Micheál Martin, and Rory will know this more than me, but his strong commitment to reconciliation on the island, seeing how things have slipped between communities in Northern Ireland and cross-border as well. So the argument, therefore, is that these are the challenges. There's a big challenge of Scottish independence. We'll see in the Assembly elections what happens. But this idea that interdependence between the islands was a reassurance to unionists, that is questioned when Scotland, or if Scotland becomes independent. Because where is the reassurance then between relations and interdependence and communication and the East-West dimension when Scotland is actually independent, no longer part of the UK? And most obviously as well, Irish unification, really, the more emphasis on that, the more there is a call for a border poll, the prioritization of that in that binary way that Pete mentioned, the more that is done, the harder it is really to have a flourishing interdependent relationship on the islands. And even in Scotland, the SNP is wary of being linked too much or at all to the Northern Ireland context because of the history of conflict. It is wary even, so I have heard, of being too connected to Sinn Féin because of any allegations of being connected to conflict in the past and the IRA. So unification, by emphasizing it too much, puts a spanner in the works actually in various ways of developing a flourishing interdependence and the trust necessary for unionists to engage with that.
Etain, I'm going to come in at that point because I know that you've got lots more to say, but you'd be astonished at how many people are asking the question about Scotland. Okay. So I hope I can just, to get to those questions, just interrupt you at that point.
Yeah, that's fine.
With apologies, but before we go to the questions, and lots have come in, are there any of the panelists who spoke before, Etain, who want to come in briefly just to pick up on briefly as possible on any points that they heard from their fellows? If so, wave at me. And Pete, jump quickly there.
It's actually, I think Etain is actually spot on. Strand 3 is critical to how we solve the protocol Brexit disaster, whatever you want to call it. And it is, I think at this point, any of us have any energy or capacity, it is how we really start to talk about how we restore the East-West relationship. I think that's critical to good relations. The protocol was too heavy in Strand 2, and we've ended up in a situation now in which the Assembly has no real say over what will happen via the protocol, and Strand 3, yet again, there's very little capacity to influence the protocol through that as well. So I think that's something which is really important to hear, and something for us to all put our energies into over the next few months.
Thank you very much, and that's very decisive, Pete. But let's go to some of the questions, and we've lots of them in. So I'm just going to go first to Niall Martin. Niall, a journalist, very good to have you with us, Niall. But he's asked a question which I think he's put beautifully using one of the terms that keeps coming up in the context of Northern Ireland. With constructive ambiguity in mind, is there a way of having a 32 county entity that doesn't have an ownership aspect? The question goes on, but I'm going to stop it there and maybe begin with you, Claire, on that, because you began by alluding to the provision that the Good Friday Agreement makes to be British and Irish, to utilise ambiguity in a constructive way. It's something we might aspire to, but at a grassroots level and realistically, is constructive ambiguity around either terminology or around the protocols of constitutional possessions, let's put it that way, is it in fact feasible or realistic to think in those terms? And I wonder, in asking that question on Niall's behalf, you might talk a little bit about the Assembly itself, as you have direct experience of it, and whether that idea of a constructive ambiguity has any mileage within the chamber.
It's interesting because, often we hear in Northern Ireland people talking about moving away from the green and orange politics, as I had talked about in my initial contribution. But the remit of the Northern Ireland Assembly and its ability actually to do anything about the constitutional position in itself is limited. And the only reason we designate as a unionist or nationalist or indeed other is to ensure a balanced cross-community representation if there are any votes that tend to be contentious and are required by that. And on a day-to-day grassroots level, this isn't something that comes up very often for me, and indeed perhaps the last number of weeks, and I think even increasingly since Brexit, people have been starting to talk about their kind of constitutional preference. And I think that has come out of the conversations around a potential border poll and, what Brexit brought with that. I suppose it demonstrates, if anything, that 23 years later, we are still deeply divided. And I think it's important to come back to the point about how the Good Friday Agreement in itself has never been fully implemented, yet we have suggestions that we move towards something else, a new model. And I think if we get back to the principles of the Good Friday Agreement and recognise that there are two very distinct communities within Northern Ireland, as well as others, it's not just unionism and nationalism, there are other people who don't identify with that at all. But it is the fundamental basis on which we were able to move forward. And maybe the conversation shouldn't be about changing the Good Friday Agreement, and it should be more about genuinely implementing it. And that does include East-West, North-South relations. It's about everything. For me, how we make Northern Ireland work, Ireland work, the United Kingdom work, is that we provide the best services from a governance perspective. And in doing that, that means we have to look at society and what that means. We have to look at our socially deprived areas. We have to look at the health service, and we have to look at opportunities that exist cross-border, but also east-west. I hear this often that, people in Ireland don't want us, people in England don't want us. My unionism isn't on the basis of what people in London want or what people in Cork want. My unionism is on the basis that I, as someone who lives in Northern Ireland, has a valid role to play, and I have my seat at that table of being within the United Kingdom. And I use this phrase often, whereas some of our parts, that's what about being in the union is about. But I think we strengthen that by this conversation around interdependency, which I think is important. And people ask me, what do you think if Scotland? I do think it will be difficult in terms of the geographical position of the United Kingdom and I suppose the integrity of the United Kingdom. But equally, I think we need to look at this on a wider context and what it means to be part of the union and what each of us brings to that.
Yeah, thank you, Clara. And I'm going to pick up on moving from the conceptual question that we put to you to a much more fundamental and practical one, combining questions that have come in from two people. Bill Emmett, chair of the Trinity Longroom Hub, has asked about infrastructure and joint infrastructure development in particular, and the basic level of rail and road transport, how ports are operating, why connections don't work, even on a north-south basis, Belfast, Dublin, in the way that they might work between London and Birmingham. But I want to link that infrastructure question to a point that it's come in indirectly from, I'm just going to get the name here, Gerard O'Malley, who is writing about education, but in fact, I'm going to leave that aside for now. And Gerard refers to the fact that he was involved in Enterprise Ireland cross-border initiatives after the Good Friday Agreement. Now, Rory, coming to you, you talked about one of the hesitations of interdependence being around the area of investment. Etain, you've alluded to the work of the British Irish Chamber of Commerce. Is this the area in terms of economics as well as infrastructure, but in terms specifically of business, that we're not getting enough interdependence and interrelationships and effort being made? That of course government financing is coming in, but a business culture has not adopted interdependence as enthusiastically as it should. And then I'm going to harness that question to the question Bill Emmett has asked about infrastructure. Is that where we're falling down? I don't know who wants to take that. Rory, I might come to you on the business question. Why has business not taken charge of this and made things work?
By all means. Well, I think first of all, in fairness, there has been a lot of effort, both by governments and by representative bodies like IBEC and CBI, as I mentioned, and there has been an increase in levels of trade between North and South, and there's a great deal of, as we well discovered during the debate on Brexit, an enormous amount of sort of daily cross-border activity. And I can't remember, Simon Coveney used to always talk about, I think chickens which were, eggs were laid in the South and chickens born in the North, or vice versa. So there's a lot of interaction, but businesses in the end have to make business decisions and have to decide to what extent they want to enter new markets. And the reality, of course, is, as I said, that certainly pre-Brexit, the relationship with Great Britain was more important for both North and South separately than the relationship between them. But I think, in terms of the activity of state agencies, Intertrade Ireland is one of the North-South bodies. I think quite a lot is being done. Just on investment, then, I was talking specifically about inward investment by foreign companies. And of course, we have different offers in terms of corporation tax, for example, let's be very blunt about it. The IDA did not want the albatross of Northern Ireland emerging from violence around its neck, as it was trying to sell Ireland as a location for inward investment, and I'd say it's competition. And if you were an Irish politician, would you rather see jobs go to a constituency in the Republic or a constituency in the North, and vice versa? So, but that's perhaps a very specific case. I think there's an interest in developing trade. Physical infrastructure, again, it depends. I mean, there has been an enormous investment in the Republic over the last 20, 30 years, initially with EU funding and then with our own. Again, as a kid, I remember part of the great excitement about going to visit my relations in Belfast was the fact of going at all of 60 miles an hour on the M1 with my parents, the only motorway on the whole island at the time. But now, of course, as anyone can see, the road network in the Republic is much superior to that in the North. So lots of investment has been made. But again, part of it is money. I mean, there's much talk about a Dublin-Belfast rail corridor, and there's no doubt that it's mad that you can. The bus gets to Belfast. You get to Glengall Street on the bus from Custom House much faster than you get to Lanyon Place. But again, you're talking enormous sums of money. So I think there is scope for more discussion and analysis. But at the same time, when plans are produced for longer term economic investment and infrastructure investment, they tend to be pretty focused on what happen to be the priorities at any given time of those making the spending decisions.
And thank you, Rory. I know Pete's trying to get in there as well. Pete, a response on that one?
I think it's really important in terms of new thinking and interdependence and the realities of the island, that we stop thinking about two economies. Belfast is a strong, vibrant economy. Dublin clearly is a strong, vibrant economy. And we've had a very, Claire will know this from where she lives, an abandonment of rural Ireland, north and south. And it would seem to me that is one of the problems, as we think about these two places as having two economies, when in fact we have on the island probably 4 or 5 economies. So I think first of all, we need that conceptual breakthrough. We need to start thinking in that way. Clearly, if we were talking about interdependence, what we should be talking about is how do we drive economic growth from Derry to Limerick? How do we take those places in that have been abandoned, and how we set this as a project? Now, the big problem, of course, is the economic model in which we live in, this neoliberal model, is not about diffusing wealth from the cores, Dublin and Belfast, out to those rural areas that have been abandoned. So I think that's important. I think also what is really important is how we get that business sector to start thinking north-south. And I think what's really interesting, this goes back to this nonsense about, unionism is a homogenous thing. I'm sure when there's DUP politicians who are not particularly keen in north-south trade, I will tell you that my pro-union business friends are putting their hair out. They want nothing more. They want to make income. They want to have investment. That's what they want. So it seems to me that it's not guided in that way, and it comes into the touchy politics. But the role here is for civic society. For us to build a new Ireland, whether we stay constitutionally separate or we join, there's a much more important role for civic society to bring in evidence, to challenge policy, and to put forward alternatives for the island. I think that's really important, and it's something the Good Friday Agreement hasn't really driven in the way that it could have done.
Well, I'm pleased you touched on the urban-rural difference there, Pete. And in fact, a question that's come in from Miriam Ryan is, I think, a very interesting one. And she's talking about poverty in North and West Belfast, because, of course, we've got a difference between urban and rural. But even within Belfast itself, we've got various different levels in terms of economic wealth and health, indeed. So we're not talking about a level playing field across Northern Ireland at all. And you've made that very clear. And Ireland, indeed, as well. I think that's well recognised. Let me come to the question that's come up from a lot of people. And it's certainly, I'll put it into, I'll use the words of Andy Murphy, Professor of English in Trinity, who's asked about the implications of a Scottish referendum for the situation with Northern Ireland. Etain, I'll come to you on that, because obviously you began to discuss the archipelago as a whole in this respect. And I wonder if you could look again at the question of what might happen in Scotland, but also if I can add a rider onto that, which I hope is not inappropriate, but the East-West relation might well now look a lot further west. Are there any implications we need to think about of a new government in the United States that have to be factored into interdependence in a different way at this point?
Okay, well, yeah, I think firstly on Scotland, it's a crucial issue because, really there's been a series of polls which show increased support for independence, and polls showing support for the SNP. And as the paper yesterday showed, I'm trying to remember, Kieran Martin's paper, that regardless of which party, now there are divisions that the Scottish people vote for. If they vote for a constellation of parties all wanting independence, that's all that counts in the next Assembly elections. So I think it's very crucial. It's crucial for the drive for those who are trying to achieve a border poll more imminently than others in Ireland. That, could give a fill-up to that sort of movement. Particularly with the argument that then Northern Ireland can be in the EU, and that's been a motivation for Scotland. So it's very crucial. And it changes, as I said, the framework if there was an independent Scotland. It changes the relationship, even with talk of it between, in my opinion, between unionists in Northern Ireland and Scotland, where it's less clear cut that there is, that sense, as I said, of Britishness. On the US dimension, I feel Rory might be better equipped somehow answering that, but I think it's obviously positive for Ireland that President Biden is in power. He always stresses his Irish roots. He's also obviously a shrewd, pragmatic politician. He won't want to alienate the UK. And we've had recently the corporation tax announcement, which obviously would undermine Irish interests in that area. So I think it's very helpful he's there, particularly compared to his predecessor. I think he will be very facilitating of any type of initiatives where US help would help, but I wouldn't either overstate his influence. So I think that would be my answer. I did want to say very briefly, just on the diversification of regional development, that the Shared Island Unit does emphasize that. I mean, maybe there isn't enough money to do it, but there is an attempt to do that. So I just thought that should be mentioned in line with the last question. And sorry for going over time. I never
No, not at all. And just while I've got you there on the shared island rather than island terminology, or island rather than Ireland terminology, Glenn Loughran asks that question. What is to be gained politically with the replacement of the title Ireland with island in the shared island proposals? That's Glenn Loughran from our partner institution, TU Dublin. Etain, I'll throw that one at you, but throw it back for a later discussion.
So could you repeat it? Shared island versus what?
Shared island rather than shared Ireland, I think is what Glenn is asking.
Yeah, I think that's really the attempt to, again, Rory will know this more than me, but the attempt to ratchet down a little the talk of a united Ireland. Micheál Martin's approach, he says it explicitly, is to build reconciliation. And he has talked about his experience as a student of going to Northern Ireland to learn about unionism, where he came from had Republican feelings, and how it changed him. So his priority is reconciliation. And I think that is the reason, because it would be an alarm bell to unionists to talk of a shared Ireland. And it already is, because many do. So that, to me, is the main reason.
Indeed, thank you. And I'm noting just on the business question or enterprise question from Donald Denham, reports coming in, or report from tonight's news, North-South trade has increased 98% since Brexit, whereas East-West trade has decreased by 53%. So if those figures, if I'm reading those figures correctly, that speaks dramatically to the discussion that we're having. I'd like to come back to questions that are coming in really relating to the historical time frame that we're talking in, and going back to before 98, way back to 1921. And Pete, you I think were perhaps, if I understood you correctly, suggesting that people attaching historical baggage to the current situation are doing us a disservice. We need to free ourselves, to liberate ourselves with the kind of thinking that attended the foundation of Northern Ireland in 1921. But I wonder if I can attach that to what Claire was talking about as well, this idea of being trapped in particular teleological narratives, trapped in ideas of inevitability, I think, Claire, was how you put it, that we're in a narrative moving us towards a border poll with a particular outcome, and people understandably feel aggrieved and alienated by that narrative. Now, this is a question, I don't know if either of you want to tackle it, but in respect of that historical timeline, are there problems surfacing at the moment because we are thinking in terms of centenaries, because we are looking back to foundational moments, and because at the same time this border poll issue pulls us towards a future which may not necessarily help the current situation? How do we get out of those narratives? Pete, Claire, this was something both of you, I think, touched on.
Just one thing very quickly, sorry, Eve. One of the reasons why the Taoiseach has to be careful is Good Friday Agreement, the territorial claim in Northern Ireland went. This is not the same as Germany, where they had a ministry that could work for reunification. And clearly within the Good Friday Agreement, it's the Secretary of State who calls a border poll. So I think if the Irish government ever set anything up which was promoting a united Ireland in a very direct manner, that would break the terms of the Good Friday Agreement. We have to realise, of course, what we do is we always say in these conversations, let's not talk about the binary, and then we end up back in the binary. And I would assume that most young people in Northern Ireland are not sitting tonight wondering about 1921, and I'm sure most of the citizens of Northern Ireland are not doing that either. And I think this is the way in which we don't understand, or we don't promote enough, the complexity of identity, etc. So, for example, 40% of DUP voters are pro-marriage equality. Okay, so the reason why their unionism is also obviously greater than their support of marriage equality. So whenever we have a conversation about Northern Ireland, everything comes into binaries. If I was to have that conversation about the South and say everybody in Dublin was the same as everybody in Cork, and you'd be quite miffed. You would find that that's a bit ridiculous. There's diversity, there's regionalism, and so too is the case in Northern Ireland. The majority of people are from the surveys that we produce. It's the slide I put up earlier. they are not sitting constantly having conversations about the constitutional issue. They're having conversations about poverty, they're having conversations about education, they're having conversations about delayed adulthood, the same conversations that are taking place in Dublin.
Yeah.
Okay. So first of all, we need to change the way we read the place, because we stereotype it and we simplify it for our own ends. And going back to the question about 1921, you know, if we live in a society of globalization, if we live in a society of gender equality, we live in a society of sexual identity change, etc., and we live in a world in which you know, economic wealth or social mobility makes us more individual and less collective, then that's something we have to reason. So, you know, it's the way in which the media increasingly has become fixated upon the binary in Northern Ireland and is using the binary in Northern Ireland to reproduce itself. And when you go on the media and you talk about inter-community engagement, we recently mapped 13,000 inter-community projects in Northern Ireland in the last 15 years. You cannot get that stuff on the media. You cannot get recognition for that. So it is this maturity of thinking and evidence in which we talk about the place properly, which is critical to how we actually have this broader conversation.
I'm getting away from the meta narratives I've been talking about. Claire, I wonder if I could bring you in again briefly as we're moving towards a close, either on this question of this narrative pull of inevitability, or perhaps on a related issue, which is coming in a couple of questions from Sean Darcy, Gerard O'Malley, both asking about education. Now, obviously, usually with Northern Ireland, the question of integrated education is the one that comes up. But I wonder if I could shift the ground a little and say to you, do we actually need to start thinking about educating the next generation differently for interdependence and against the binary systems that Pete is talking about? I mean, is that where it has to start?
Yes, education entirely is where it needs to start, because, you know, I think that's the challenges that we're seeing within Northern Ireland. And I suppose if we do think about the violence over the last number of weeks, it's typically happening in the most socially deprived areas across Northern Ireland. And that's not a coincidence. You know, I think what we need to do is we need to inspire those communities. We need to give them opportunities so that they can find a better alternative to this type of behaviour, or indeed the paramilitaries within those communities that want to keep them down for their own criminal behaviours. So, you know, I think that is important. To come back to the inevitability question, you know, I can't stress enough that a united Ireland is not inevitable, because, you know, people are saying that it isn't, because this conversation seems to be quite live at the minute. You know, I think what's important, you know, to be respectful of both communities within Northern Ireland, and indeed those who maybe haven't made their mind up, we have to recognise that as per the Good Friday Agreement, the people of Northern Ireland will self-determine the constitutional position. And I think if we start gaslighting people and saying that it's inevitable, then I don't think we should be surprised when people get a bit, you know, insecure about their identity and their constitutional position. And I think that's quite a dangerous thing. And I think we need to be very careful around the language, even in terms of the conversation around a shared island and shared islands. You know,
yeah.
If Ireland, you know, is respectful of Northern Ireland and wants to recognise Northern Ireland's current position, that's within the context of the United Kingdom. So for us, that is islands. And, you know, I don't think it's enough to say that we can have a north-south dimension without having an east-west dimension. So I think what is being presented by, you know, Professor Shirlow is a really positive way of implementing the Good Friday Agreement and what was hoped for. Because again, what I think we have to recognise that, yes, 23 years later, we have moved on considerably. But there are still deeply divided tensions, and I think it does come back to the point about implementing the Good Friday Agreement, and I can't see any alternative to that to satisfy both communities in Northern Ireland who still hold very important and valid beliefs.
Thanks, Claire. And I know, Etain, you were trying to get in either on this point or the previous one, and I can give you a minute, Etain, if you still want to come back in.
I don't know, does Rory want to come in?
I'll get you both in. You go ahead.
Your time. I think my point I was going to say was around that shared island discussion as well. It was Bill Emmett's question, I think, or the other persons on trade. There are limits to trade. My PhD was on the impact of the EU on cross-border trade and different things, and businesses, as Rory said, are pragmatic. So it's the same for Scotland and Wales. We compete, you know, whiskey gourmet products, all of that, that there are limits. That was my point on that, I think.
Great.
And I just
Thanks,
echo Claire's points. I really like some of the arguments I'm hearing.
Absolutely. Rory, I can give you 15 seconds.
Okay, like it or not, the Good Friday Agreement does, in its very first article, present a binary choice between a sovereign United Ireland and the union with Great Britain, and either choice is legitimate. So I think the important thing for us all is to recognise that, and to recognise that there is a legitimate nationalist aspiration, as there is an absolutely legitimate unionist aspiration. The question is it possible for us all to carry on implementing all of the wonderful potential for interdependence and the actuality of interdependence that has been described by Pete, that I have tried to talk about with North-South, that Claire has talked about, Attain has talked about? Can we do all this while recognizing that we cannot get away from politics? This provides a backdrop, but at the same time, there's an awful lot we can do together. And I think in a way we had hoped in drafting the Good Friday Agreement, all this seemed like a very remote prospect, the question of a vote on unification. And I think the belief at the time was that the future should be left to the future to determine.
Thank you.
Au temps, as President Mitterrand used to say. So I think that is still perhaps the best approach we can have. But the reality is there's also a legal obligation on the Secretary of State. So I think if what Pete says in his polls turns out to be correct and borne out, then the issue becomes a lot less acute than it may seem to be at the moment. But equally, if it doesn't, then unfortunately we are right back into a very difficult binary polarizing argument, which has the potential to spoil all that we can do positively together. And I think we all have to say, no matter what our analysis or our aspiration, that there's a lot that is good that we can and should continue doing together.
Thank you, Rory. And that's a positive note on which, unfortunately, to draw to a close, and we are out of time. We will be returning to this subject. And I want to close by thanking everyone who asked questions. I apologize, we couldn't get to all of them, but it was great to have the level of interest. I want to thank the team at the Trinity Long Room Hub for putting this together, and to thank our sponsor, the John Pollard Foundation. Thank you everyone who's joined us for this really important discussion, but most of all, thank you to the panel, to Pete, to Rory, to Claire, and to Attain for giving us your expertise and your time this evening. And with that, I'll draw to a close. Thank you again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the evening.
Thank you.